On the morning of May 6th, 2026, at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, a single F-18's Super Hornet launched off the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, rolled in on a moving target roughly 100 feet longer than 3 football fields, and did something the United States Navy had never done before in this specific way. A first-of-its-kind engagement that would go on to define an entire new chapter of how modern naval power gets applied against a blockade runner. It didn't drop a bomb. It didn't fire a missile. It opened up with its 20mm Vulcan cannon and put a burst of rounds directly into the rudder of an Iranian-flagged oil tanker called the MT Hasna, crippling its steering and stopping a 383-meter vessel dead in its tracks without sinking it, without killing a single person aboard, and without spilling a drop of oil into the Gulf of Oman, a level of restraint that would have seemed almost impossible in a comparable naval engagement fought with the weapons and targeting technology available even one generation earlier. That single engagement marked the opening shot in one of the strangest and most precise blockade enforcement campaigns in modern naval history, and over the following days it would be followed by an even more surgical strike, using laser-guided munitions fired directly into the smokestacks of 2 more Iranian tankers, a follow-on operation that only reinforced just how deliberate and repeatable this entire enforcement doctrine had become. So today we're breaking down exactly how the United States Navy turned its carrier air wing into what amounts to a maritime traffic enforcement unit, why targeting a ship's rudder or its funnel instead of its hull or its cargo tanks represents such a deliberate and specific military doctrine, and what this entire campaign tells us about how precisely modern American air power can now apply force without crossing into the kind of destruction that would have been almost unavoidable in a similar engagement even a decade ago, back when precision-guided weaponry hadn't yet reached the level of maturity these 3 specific strikes went on to demonstrate. Let's start with how this blockade came to exist in the first place, because the F-18 strikes didn't happen in isolation. They were the enforcement mechanism for a policy that had been building for weeks. The war between the United States, Israel, and Iran erupted on February 28, 2026, and after weeks of intense fighting under an operation the Pentagon referred to as Epic Fury, a ceasefire was eventually reached. But that ceasefire proved fragile, and negotiations meant to build on it collapsed in the following weeks. On April 12th, President Trump announced on social media that the United States would begin intercepting vessels attempting to enter or exit Iranian ports in the U.S. Navy formally instituted a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz the following day. Just before that, on April 11th, American naval forces had already begun mine clearance operations near the strait, after intelligence assessments concluded that Iranian naval forces had scattered sea mines throughout the waterway during the earlier phase of fighting. That detail matters because it tells you the blockade wasn't simply about denying Iran shipping revenue. It was layered on top of an already dangerous, mine-contaminated waterway that American mine-clearing groups had to actively work to make safe even before commercial or military vessels could reliably transit it. The scale of the enforcement architecture built around this blockade is genuinely staggering once you lay it out in full. According to defense reporting on the operation, the tankers involved in these May engagements were operating inside a maritime enforcement structure involving more than 20 U.S. warships, nearly 200 aircraft, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, dedicated mine-clearing groups, and Marine Corps boarding detachments, all working together across a stretch of water running from the Arabian Sea through the Strait of Hormuz itself. That's not a handful of ships loosely patrolling a choke point. That's a fully integrated, layered blockade architecture combining carrier aviation, destroyers, electronic warfare aircraft, ISR platforms, and marine boarding teams into a single coordinated enforcement system. The kind of comprehensive maritime interdiction operation that defense analysts have suggested could reshape how future blockades get conducted at other contested choke points around the world, well beyond this specific conflict with Iran. And just one day before that first F-18 engagement against the Hasna, President Trump had announced a separate but related initiative called Project Freedom, a military operation specifically aimed at defending commercial shipping vessels as they transited the Strait of Hormuz, distinct from the blockade itself but running in parallel with it. On the very first day Project Freedom got underway, U.S. Army AH-64, Apache helicopters, and MH-60 Seahawks destroyed 6 Iranian small boats that CENTCOM's own commander, Admiral Brad Cooper, described as actively threatening commercial shipping the U.S. was escorting through the strait. Cooper told reporters during a media roundtable that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had launched multiple cruise missiles, drones, and small boats specifically at the vessels American forces were protecting. Despite that attack, the 4-week-old ceasefire remained technically intact, according to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, who briefed reporters in Washington on the state of the conflict. But Project Freedom itself turned out to be remarkably short-lived. Paused just a single day after it began, even as the broader blockade enforcement against Iranian ports continued uninterrupted. It's also worth noting just how significant it is that this enforcement campaign was being run using not one but two separate aircraft carriers operating in the same theater at the same time, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS George H.W. Bush. Maintaining a single carrier strike group on station in a contested region like the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman is already an enormous logistical undertaking, requiring a constant rotation of support ships, fuel, munitions, resupply, and personnel. Having two full carrier strike groups operating in the same theater simultaneously, as both the Hasna strike and the later Sea Star 3 and Sevda strikes demonstrate, reflects a level of sustained American military commitment to this specific blockade that goes well beyond a symbolic show of force. It meant CENTCOM had enough carrier-based air power on hand to keep near-continuous coverage across the entire approach to the Strait of Hormuz, with aircraft available to respond to blockade runners, regardless of which specific stretch of water they attempted to cross, which is exactly the kind of persistent, redundant coverage a blockade enforcement mission like this one actually requires to be effective over an extended period of time, rather than just for a single dramatic engagement. Now let's get into the actual mechanics of what happened to the Hasna, because the specific tactical choice involved here tells you almost everything about the doctrine driving this entire campaign. According to CENTCOM's official statement, American forces observed the Hasna, an Iranian-flagged tanker, making way through the Gulf of Oman toward Iranian ports. After the vessel ignored several separate warnings to change course, it was targeted by an F-18's Super Hornet, operating from the Abraham Lincoln. The jet fired several rounds from its 20mm cannon directly into the ship's rudder, and CENTCOM confirmed the strike had disabled the tanker's steering, leaving it physically incapable of completing its voyage. Data collected by shipping tracking services indicated the Hasna had been sailing toward Iran from somewhere out in the Indian Ocean when it was intercepted. It's worth understanding just how difficult a shot that actually represents in practical terms. Hitting a rudder specifically, a relatively small, submerged or partially submerged steering surface at the stern of a moving vessel, using cannon fire from a fast-moving fighter jet, requires an extraordinary level of precision targeting and aircraft control. This wasn't a warning shot fired somewhere near the ship to intimidate its crew into compliance. It was a deliberately placed burst of fire aimed at exactly the one component that would immediately and completely end the ship's ability to steer itself toward an Iranian port, while leaving every other system aboard, the hull, the cargo tanks, the crew quarters, completely untouched. That distinction, mission kill rather than destruction, is really the entire doctrine driving this campaign, and it's worth explaining clearly because it represents a genuinely deliberate strategic choice rather than a matter of restraint born out of caution alone. Defense reporting on the broader enforcement operation described the strikes as consistently focused on disabling propulsion, specifically targeting rudders, smokestacks, and exhaust uptakes, rather than cargo tanks or the waterline sections of the hull. That targeting pattern indicates a mission-kill doctrine intended to immobilize a vessel completely while deliberately avoiding catastrophic flooding, major hydrocarbon releases into the water, or large-scale casualties among the crew. Think about what the alternative would look like. If American forces had simply fired a missile into the hull of a loaded oil tanker to stop it, you'd risk an environmental disaster on a scale that could dwarf the military objective entirely, spilling potentially millions of gallons of crude into one of the most ecologically and economically sensitive waterways on the planet. A body of water bordered by multiple nations that have absolutely nothing to do with this specific conflict. You'd also risk killing merchant sailors who, in many cases, are simply crew members following orders from a shipping company, not combatants in any meaningful military sense. By instead targeting the rudder, the smokestack, or the exhaust system, American forces can stop a vessel just as completely from a strategic standpoint, denying Iran the ability to move that ship and its cargo, while avoiding almost all of the collateral consequences that would come with a more conventional strike against the hull itself. It's worth taking a moment to understand exactly what kind of aircraft and weaponry made a shot like this even possible in the first place. The F-18E and F Super Hornet is the U.S. Navy's primary carrier-based strike fighter, a twin-engine, single or two-seat aircraft capable of operating in both air-to-air and air-to-ground roles, and it's been the backbone of American carrier aviation for years. Its internal M61A2 Vulcan cannon is a 6-barreled rotary-fire weapon capable of putting out rounds at an extraordinarily high rate of fire, giving a pilot the ability to walk a burst of fire precisely onto a small, specific point on a target, rather than simply spraying rounds across a general area. Pairing that cannon with the aircraft's targeting systems, which allow a pilot to track and lock onto a specific point on a moving vessel from a considerable standoff distance, is exactly what made it possible to reliably hit something as narrow and specific as a rudder on a moving tanker, rather than simply peppering the ship's hull more broadly. That's a meaningfully different skill set than traditional strafing runs against stationary or lightly defended ground targets, and it reflects years of training and doctrine development specifically aimed at giving naval aviators the kind of surgical precision this blockade enforcement mission actually required. There's also a layer of irony worth pointing out in how Iran responded publicly in the immediate aftermath of the Hasna strike. Just hours after CENTCOM confirmed it had disabled the tanker, Iran's state-run IRNA news agency put out a message directed at commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, saying Iranian ports were fully prepared to provide general maritime services and support to any ships that needed it. Reuters correspondents covering the story noted specifically that this announcement came out just hours after the American military had confirmed disabling an Iranian-flagged tanker attempting to reach one of those very ports. That's a genuinely strange piece of messaging to release on the same day your own flagged vessel gets crippled by American cannon fire while trying to reach exactly the kind of port you're publicly advertising as open for business. It reads less like confident defiance and more like a regime trying to project normalcy to the outside world. While its own maritime fleet was actively being picked apart by a blockade, it couldn't do anything to stop. 2 days later, on May 8th, the campaign escalated in a way that showed off an entirely different, even more precise category of American weaponry. CENTCOM announced that U.S. forces had disabled 2 more Iranian-flagged tankers, the MTC Star 3 and the MT Sevda, as both vessels attempted to enter an Iranian port on the Gulf of Oman in violation of the blockade. This time, the strike came from a different carrier entirely, with an F-18's Super Hornet launched from the USS George H.W. Bush, firing precision munitions directly into the smokestacks of both tankers. CENTCOM released video of the engagements, and the footage tells its own story about just how controlled these strikes actually were. In the clip showing the Sea Star 3, you can see slight puffs of smoke rising from the vessel's smokestack, followed moments later by much darker, heavier smoke after the munition impacted. In the Sevda footage, a burst of flame appears briefly, immediately followed by plumes of heavy black smoke pouring out of the funnel. Critically, no damage beyond that specific funnel or smokestack area is visible anywhere else on either vessel in the footage CENTCOM provided, and the release made no mention of any casualties aboard either ship. Military analysts who reviewed that footage for CNN offered a fascinating technical breakdown of what likely happened. Experts assessed that the Navy jet probably used 500-pound laser-guided bombs to achieve that level of precision against a target as specific as a ship's smokestack, a considerably more sophisticated and expensive weapon than the cannon fire used against the Hasna 2 days earlier. One CNN military analyst, a retired Air Force colonel named Cedric Leighton, raised an even more interesting possibility, suggesting the Navy jet may have used inert munitions, bombs carrying little to no explosive payload, specifically to disable rather than sink the tankers. Leighton pointed to the lack of any large secondary explosions or major blast damage in the footage as evidence supporting that theory, noting that an actual live explosive warhead detonating inside a ship's smokestack would likely have produced a considerably more violent and visually dramatic result than what CENTCOM's video actually showed. Whether the munitions involved were genuinely inert or simply extremely precisely fused to limit their effect, the practical outcome was identical to the Hasna strike 2 days earlier. Both tankers were left dead in the water, both crews were left unharmed as far as CENTCOM's public statements indicated, and neither vessel was able to complete its journey into Iranian territorial waters. CENTCOM's own summary after that second engagement was direct and almost matter-of-fact about the cumulative results of the campaign to that point, stating plainly that all 3 vessels, the Hasna, the Sea Star 3, and the Sevda, were no longer transiting to Iran. That's the entire operational objective of this campaign, summarized in a single sentence. Stop the ships, don't sink them, don't kill the crews, just make absolutely certain none of them complete their voyage. And the scale of that enforcement effort extended well beyond just the 3 vessels that actually got hit. According to reporting on the broader blockade at the time, more than 50 additional ships had already been redirected by CENTCOM forces, specifically to ensure compliance with the blockade, meaning the overwhelming majority of vessels attempting to test American resolve in the strait were being turned away or rerouted through warnings, boardings, and shows of force well before it ever escalated to the point of actual weapons fire. The 3 tankers that did get struck represent the visible, dramatic edge of a much larger, mostly quieter enforcement effort playing out across the entire waterway day after day. It's also worth understanding the broader international dimension of this blockade enforcement effort because it wasn't a purely unilateral American operation happening in a vacuum. France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom all publicly declared their support for efforts to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz to normal commercial traffic, as did the European Union collectively. France went a step further than mere declarations, deploying its aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, through the Suez Canal and into the Red Sea, specifically in preparation for a joint UK-France mission focused on the Strait. A French presidency official explained the reasoning behind that deployment directly to reporters, saying that the continued blockade of Hormuz was causing increasingly pronounced damage to the world economy, and that the risk of hostilities dragging on any longer was simply too serious to accept without action. That's a genuinely significant statement, a major European power explicitly framing its own military deployment, not as taking sides in the underlying war between America, Israel, and Iran, but as a direct response to the economic damage being caused by a closed or contested Strait of Hormuz, a waterway through which roughly a quarter of the entire planet's seaborne oil trade and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas normally passes. Even China, which has historically maintained a much closer economic relationship with Iran than most Western nations, found itself publicly pushing for de-escalation around this same issue. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, met with China's foreign minister in Beijing around this same period, and while Araghchi used the meeting to claim that Iran had achieved what he called an elevated international standing throughout the course of this war, his Chinese counterpart used the same meeting to directly urge both Iran and the United States to work toward reopening the Strait of Hormuz. When a country as economically intertwined with Iran as China is publicly pressuring Tehran to help get that waterway open again, it tells you something important about just how universally damaging this blockade situation had become, cutting across alliances and rivalries that otherwise define most of the geopolitics surrounding this entire war. It's worth putting this entire campaign into a bit of historical context, too, because the Strait of Hormuz has been the site of exactly this kind of tanker warfare before, and the contrast with the past is genuinely striking. Back in the 1980s, during the war between Iran and Iraq, both countries targeted neutral commercial tankers in and around the Gulf, so extensively that the period became known internationally as the Tanker War, a campaign that saw hundreds of vessels struck, dozens of sailors killed, and eventually drew the U. Hess' navy into escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the region to keep oil flowing. That earlier conflict was defined by exactly the kind of blunt, high-casualty tactics this current campaign has so deliberately avoided. Missiles fired into hulls, mines detonating beneath waterlines, and tankers left burning or sinking outright. The fact that the modern equivalent of that same basic strategic problem, a hostile power trying to control or threaten shipping through Hormuz, can now be addressed through cannon fire, aimed precisely at a rudder or a laser-guided bomb aimed precisely at a smokestack, without a single reported tanker crew fatality across these first three engagements, says something remarkable about how far precision-guided weaponry has advanced in the 4 decades, since that earlier tanker war made headlines around the world. Let's zoom out for a moment and think about what this specific style of warfare actually represents in the broader history of naval blockade enforcement, because it's genuinely a departure from how conflicts like this have typically unfolded in the past. Historically, enforcing a naval blockade against a determined adversary willing to run it has often meant accepting a much higher tolerance for destruction and casualties. Ships get sunk, crews get killed, oil spills into contested waters, sometimes catastrophically. That's simply been the accepted cost of denying an adversary access to shipping lanes in most conflicts throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. What the Hasna, Sea Star 3, and Sevda engagements demonstrate is a fundamentally different approach, one made possible specifically by the extraordinary precision of modern American weapon systems, from cannon-guided targeting sophisticated enough to reliably hit a moving rudder, to laser-guided munitions precise enough to disable a smokestack without so much as scorching the deck around it. That precision allows the United States to achieve the exact same strategic outcome: a vessel that cannot complete its journey and cannot generate revenue for the country it's flagged to without the environmental catastrophe, the human casualties, or the diplomatic fallout that a more conventional strike against the hull or cargo tanks would almost certainly have generated. That doesn't mean this approach is without real controversy or real risk, and it's worth being honest about both sides of that. Iran's own account of the human cost from this broader campaign of blockade enforcement has, at various points, painted a considerably more severe picture than CENTCOM's own carefully worded statements about disabled vessels and unharmed crews. Local Iranian officials in Hormozgan province reported that separate strikes against Iranian ships in the region left several crew members wounded and others reported missing, a detail that stands in real tension with CENTCOM's repeated public framing of these operations as precisely targeted, casualty-free engagements against ship systems rather than ship crews. Reconciling those two accounts is genuinely difficult from the outside, and it's worth acknowledging, honestly, rather than pretending every single engagement in this broader blockade campaign has gone exactly as cleanly as the widely publicized Hasna, Sea Star 3, and Sevda strikes did. Precision targeting reduces risk dramatically compared to older, blunter methods of naval interdiction, but it doesn't reduce that risk to zero, And a blockade enforced across dozens of vessels and multiple carrier strike groups over an extended period of time is never going to produce a perfectly clean record every single time. There's also a strategic question worth sitting with about what this kind of precision-enforced blockade actually accomplishes in the bigger picture of this war. Disabling 3 tankers, however dramatic and technically impressive each individual engagement was, doesn't by itself end Iran's broader ability to threaten shipping or resist international pressure. What it does accomplish is something more incremental, but arguably just as important over time. It establishes, unambiguously and repeatedly, that any vessel attempting to run this blockade will be caught, and that the consequence for getting caught is a certain, swift, and completely non-negotiable end to that specific voyage. That kind of demonstrated certainty matters enormously in deterrence theory. A blockade that occasionally lets ships through or that responds inconsistently to violations invites more attempts to test it. A blockade that responds to every single documented attempt with a precise, unavoidable, publicly broadcast disabling strike sends an unmistakable signal to every other tanker operator and every other shipping company still considering whether to risk a run to an Iranian port. It's simply not going to work, and the video evidence proving that gets released to the world within days of each attempt. It's worth putting a number on exactly why the world was watching this specific stretch of water so closely throughout all of this. The Strait of Hormuz normally carries roughly a quarter of the entire planet's seaborne oil trade and about a fifth of its liquefied natural gas, funneling through a choke point narrow enough that a handful of disabled tankers, a scattering of sea mines, or a sustained blockade can meaningfully affect global energy prices within days. Every tanker turned back, every vessel redirected by CENTCOM to avoid violating the blockade, and every ship that got disabled outright represented a direct disruption to that flow, rippling outward into fuel costs and shipping insurance premiums for countries that had absolutely nothing to do with the underlying conflict between Washington, Tehran, and Jerusalem. That's exactly why the involvement of France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom in supporting efforts to keep the strait open wasn't simply an act of solidarity with the United States. It reflected each of those nations' own direct economic exposure to a waterway they don't control, but depend on just as heavily as anyone actually fighting this war. And that's really the broader significance sitting underneath these 3 specific tanker strikes. This wasn't really a story about 3 ships getting hit. It was a demonstration, deliberately choreographed and deliberately publicized through official CENTCOM video releases, of exactly how completely the United States Navy could now enforce a blockade using its most advanced carrier aviation assets without needing to resort to the kind of destructive, casualty-heavy tactics that similar operations might have required in previous decades, the kind of tactics that defined the tanker war of the 1980s and countless other maritime conflicts before precision-guided weaponry reached this level of maturity. Every tanker operator watching those videos, every shipping company weighing whether to risk sending a vessel toward an Iranian port, and every foreign government deciding whether to lend political or military support to the broader blockade effort, all received the exact same message from those grainy CENTCOM strike clips. The United States now has the technical capability to stop exactly the ship it wants to stop, exactly where it wants to stop it, without spilling the oil, without sinking the vessel, and without killing the crew, and it's fully willing to use that capability again and again for as long as this blockade needs to remain in place, no matter how many tankers Iran continues to send toward those same ports. There's a broader lesson here, too, about how this kind of precision-first doctrine might reshape future conflicts well beyond this particular war. Every major navy in the world is watching how the United States handled this specific problem, and the demonstrated ability to stop a large commercial vessel completely, reliably, and repeatedly without sinking it, without spilling its cargo, and without killing its crew sets a new benchmark for what blockade enforcement can look like when a military has the technology and the training to pull it off. That has implications for how other contested waterways around the world might eventually get managed, from the South China Sea to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait off Yemen, both of which have their own long histories of exactly the kind of shipping disruption and military tension this campaign was built to solve in the Gulf. A doctrine proven successful in one choke point tends to get studied, adapted, and eventually applied elsewhere. And the video evidence CENTCOM released from these 3 engagements will almost certainly end up being referenced in exactly that kind of doctrine discussion for years to come, regardless of how this specific war with Iran ultimately concludes. So where does that leave things looking forward? The blockade itself continued for weeks beyond these initial engagements, with more than 20 warships, nearly 200 aircraft, and a full layered enforcement architecture remaining in place to catch the next vessel and the one after that, willing to test whether Washington's resolve on this specific choke point would eventually crack. International pressure kept building from multiple directions simultaneously, from European navies actively deploying additional carrier assets to help enforce freedom of navigation, to China quietly pushing Tehran toward accepting some kind of resolution that would let the strait reopen to normal traffic. And Iran, for its part, kept oscillating publicly between defiant rhetoric about its elevated international standing and quieter signals, like that IRA announcement about ports being ready for business, that suggested a regime far more concerned about the economic bleeding from this blockade than its public messaging ever led on. So here's what I want to hear from you. Do you think this kind of precision, low-casualty blockade enforcement actually ends up being more effective at pressuring Iran over the long run than a more aggressive, destructive campaign would have been? Or do you think Iran simply waits this specific pressure out, the same way it's weathered other forms of economic and military pressure throughout this entire war, absorbing the loss of ship after ship, the same way it has absorbed the loss of missile sites, radar installations, and coastal defenses across every other front of this conflict? It's a genuinely difficult question because precision alone doesn't guarantee political capitulation, and a regime that's already absorbed months of strikes against its missile sites and coastal defenses has shown real willingness to keep absorbing punishment rather than change course quickly. Drop your thoughts in the comments because this is genuinely one of the more fascinating tactical stories to come out of this entire conflict. Precision warfare replacing brute force blockade tactics in real time. And I want to hear how people are reading the bigger picture here, especially given how much this specific approach differs from almost every other headline coming out of this war. It's easy to focus purely on the technical impressiveness of hitting a moving rudder with cannon fire or threading a laser-guided bomb into a smokestack without touching anything else on the ship. But the more important question is whether that kind of surgical restraint actually translates into faster political results, or whether it simply buys the world a safer, cleaner version of a standoff that could still drag on for months, regardless of how precisely each individual tanker gets stopped, leaving the fundamental question of when and how this entire war actually ends, just as unresolved as it was before the first cannon round ever left the barrel. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly how and why the Navy targeted a rudder with cannon fire one day and a smokestack with laser-guided munitions 2 days later, go ahead and hit that like button, share it with someone who saw the CENTCOM footage without understanding the doctrine behind it, and subscribe so you're here for whatever comes out of the next phase of this blockade. Because based on the pattern we've already seen, it's very unlikely this was the last tanker to test it, and it's very unlikely CENTCOM will hesitate to release the footage the moment the next one gets caught trying.